I still remember the exact moment. Standing in the middle of our open office, my colleague's eyes burning into me as Richard, my boss of 7 years, smirked and said those words. "We're downsizing, and frankly, you've been underperforming for months. Clean out your desk by lunch." No warning, no private conversation, just public execution of my career while he watched me crumble. I gathered my things in a cardboard box, held my head high, and walked out without a word. That was 3 years ago. Yesterday, I stood at Richard's funeral, not as a mourner, but as the executor of his estate. The whispers rippled through the sparse crowd when the lawyer called my name. Nobody knew that Richard had changed his will 2 months before his sudden heart attack. Nobody knew what I knew about the man who'd humiliated me. And as I approached the podium to read his final wishes, I could feel the weight of the envelope in my pocket, the one containing the truth that would change everything. I never intended to work for Richard Caldwell. Growing up in Portland, Maine, my parents ran a small printing business, honest work that taught me the value of craftsmanship and integrity. Dad always said, "In New England, your reputation is your currency." My mother, practical and sharp as the winter air, made sure I understood that education was my ticket to something bigger. They sacrificed to send me to college in Boston, first in our family to go. After graduating, I landed at Meridian Technologies in their marketing department. That's where I met Richard, the rising star, the golden boy from old Connecticut money who'd never heard the word no. He was brilliant but cruel, the kind of boss who'd praise you publicly one day and eviscerate you the next. Still, the company was growing, and I was growing with it. Richard took a particular interest in me after I saved a major client presentation when our servers crashed. "Adams," he'd say, using my last name like we were in some private school, "you're the only one around here who can think on their feet." It felt like validation, being singled out by someone whose approval seemed so impossible to earn. I still remember the first Thanksgiving after my father died. Richard had asked me to finish a proposal over the holiday weekend. I explained the situation, how my mother needed me home, how we had family traditions that mattered. "Family traditions won't keep this company profitable," he'd snapped. "But I suppose mediocrity runs in families too." I stayed up 3 nights straight at my childhood home, working after my mother went to bed, the blue light of my laptop illuminating old family photos. I delivered the proposal on time, earned the client, and Richard took all the credit at the company meeting. When I confronted him privately, he laughed. "That's how the game works, Adams. You're either a player or a pawn." The years passed, and Richard's behavior worsened as he climbed higher. He became notorious for his annual Christmas parties at his lake house in New Hampshire, lavish, excessive affairs where careers were made or broken between cocktails. It was at one such party, 5 years into my time at Meridian, that I discovered Richard's secret. I'd stepped away from the crowd, looking for a quiet moment on the sprawling property. That's when I overheard him on the phone in his study, the door slightly ajar. He was speaking frantically to someone about offshore accounts, missing funds, and cooking the books. I heard names, board members, clients, and figures that made my stomach drop. Richard was embezzling from the company, from our clients' investments, and he was involving others. I should have reported it immediately. But Richard had cultivated loyalty through fear. Who would believe me over him? And more importantly, who would protect me from the fallout? So I kept quiet, gathered evidence slowly, carefully, spreadsheets, recordings of conversations, emails forwarded to my personal account. I became his unwitting archivist of corruption. Meanwhile, Richard planned his masterpiece, what he called his grand gesture, a new headquarters for Meridian, named after himself, of course. The Caldwell Tower would be his legacy, built on stolen money and broken trust. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for the summer. He'd even commissioned a bronze statue of himself for the lobby. What Richard didn't know was that my mother had fallen ill, cancer, and the health insurance he'd slashed to streamline operations wasn't covering her treatments. Every night, I'd sit by her hospital bed, watching her fade while calculating the millions Richard had siphoned away. The contradiction was unbearable. Spring turned to summer, and Meridian was buzzing with preparations for the Caldwell Tower groundbreaking ceremony. Richard had invited city officials, business partners, and press, the whole spectacle designed to cement his legacy. The company had rented the most expensive venue in Boston, with champagne fountains and a scale model of the tower displayed on a rotating pedestal. "Adams, I need you to coordinate the PR for this," Richard announced during a meeting 2 weeks before the event. "Make sure we get coverage in all the right places. This is bigger than any of us." I nodded, swallowing the bitter irony. Bigger than any of us, indeed, especially the employees whose bonuses had mysteriously disappeared that year. Budget constraints, Richard had explained with a practiced frown. That evening, I visited my mother in the hospice facility. Her room was small but sunny, with a view of a modest garden where volunteers grew flowers for patients. She was sleeping when I arrived, so thin now that she barely made a ripple under the blankets. "How was work today?" she asked when she woke, always more concerned about me than herself. "Fine," I lied, "just planning a big event." She studied my face with eyes that had always seen through me. "You're not happy there anymore, are you?" I couldn't tell her about the evidence I'd been gathering, about how I was watching the clock run out on both her life and my career. Instead, I held her hand and changed the subject. "Remember how Dad used to say that eventually the truth always rises to the surface?" She smiled weakly. "Like cream in coffee. He was right about that." 3 days before the groundbreaking ceremony, I was working late, finalizing press packets when Richard stormed into my office. His face was flushed, his expensive tie loosened. "I need you to courier these documents to James Whitaker tonight," he said, dropping a sealed envelope on my desk. James was our chief financial officer, a nervous man who'd always seemed uncomfortable around Richard. "It's almost midnight," I pointed out. "And," Richard's eyes narrowed, "is there a problem?" I knew what was in that envelope. More falsified numbers, more evidence of the fraud. This was my moment. "Actually, yes," I said slowly. "I'm concerned about some inconsistencies I've noticed in the Caldwell Tower financing." The change in his demeanor was immediate and terrifying. His voice dropped to a whisper. "What exactly do you think you know?" "Enough to be concerned," I replied, my heart hammering. "The numbers don't add up, Richard, and I'm not the only one who's noticed." It was a bluff, but it worked. Panic flashed across his face before he regained control. "You're overworked," he said with a forced smile. "Take tomorrow off. We can discuss any concerns after the ceremony." The next morning, I received a call from the hospice. My mother had taken a turn for the worse. The doctor didn't say it, but I understood. These would be her final hours. I rushed to her side, my laptop and the evidence against Richard packed in my bag. As I sat holding her hand, watching her labored breathing, my phone began buzzing with messages from coworkers. Richard was on a rampage, searching my office, questioning my team about what I might know. He'd scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning, the day of the ceremony. My mother stirred, her eyes finding mine with surprising clarity. "Whatever you're carrying," she whispered, "it's too heavy. Let it go or let it out." She drifted back to sleep, and I made my decision. I would not let Richard continue his schemes while people suffer. I would not carry this secret any longer. That night, as I kept vigil by my mother's bedside, I prepared 2 sets of documents, one for the SEC and another for the board of directors. I also drafted a detailed email to be sent to every employee at Meridian, explaining exactly what their esteemed leader had been doing with their retirement funds and client investments. At dawn, my mother passed peacefully. I kissed her forehead, promised her I would make things right, and drove directly to the office. It was 7 a.m. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for 3 p.m. The emergency meeting Richard had called would begin in 1 hour, and I knew exactly what it was for: my public execution. The conference room was packed when I arrived. Richard stood at the head of the table, his perfect smile firmly in place, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety when he saw me enter. Our entire department was there, along with the executive team. Even James Whitaker, looking particularly ashen, was seated in the corner. "Ah, Adams," Richard announced, his voice dripping with false concern. "Thank you for joining us. I was just explaining to the team that we need to discuss some performance issues." I took the only available seat, directly across from him. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston's skyline glistened in the morning sun. In just hours, Richard would be posing with a golden shovel, breaking ground on a tower built with stolen dreams. "Before we begin," Richard continued, shuffling some papers, "I want to acknowledge that we're all under pressure with the ceremony today, but certain standards must be maintained." He launched into a practiced speech about dedication, about loyalty, about how Meridian was a family that required absolute commitment. All the while, his eyes never left mine, a predator assessing its prey. "Which brings me to why we're here," he finally said. "It seems that someone has been accessing confidential financial records without authorization. Someone has been raising unfounded concerns with potential partners." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My colleagues stared at their hands or their notebooks, no one daring to look at me. "Adams," Richard said my name like it was something distasteful. "Would you care to explain yourself?" In that moment, I thought of my mother. I thought of my father's words about reputation. I thought of all the people in this room whose financial futures were built on quicksand. "Actually, Richard," I said, my voice stronger than I expected, "I would." I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room display. "I'd like to present some findings to the group, if that's all right." Before he could object, the first spreadsheet appeared on screen. A meticulously documented trail of funds diverted from client accounts into offshore holdings. "What is this?" Richard snapped, moving to disconnect my computer. "Evidence," I replied simply. "For the past 2 years, I've been tracking discrepancies in our financial reporting, specifically discrepancies related to the Caldwell Tower project." The room erupted in whispers. Richard's face drained of color. "These are proprietary documents," he hissed. "This is corporate espionage." "No, Richard," I said, standing now. "This is fraud. And everyone in this room deserves to know that their bonuses, their retirement funds, and their clients' investments have been systematically siphoned to fund your vanity project and your lifestyle." I clicked through to the next slide. Photos of Richard's recently purchased yacht, his vacation home in the Caymans, his art collection, all paid for with Meridian money. "My mother died this morning," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "She spent her final months in a hospice that barely covered her basic needs because our health insurance was cut to reduce overhead. Meanwhile, you spent $300,000 on a bronze statue of yourself for a building that exists only on paper and in your ego." The silence in the room was absolute. Even James Whitaker had lifted his head, a strange look of relief washing over his features. "You're fired," Richard said, his voice shaking with rage. "Security will escort you out immediately." I smiled then, a genuine smile that seemed to unnerve him more than any accusation. I expected that, I said calmly, which is why I sent all of this information to the SEC, the board of directors, and every employee at Meridian 10 minutes ago. I looked at my watch. They should be reading it right about now. As if on cue, phones began buzzing and chiming throughout the room. Richard's own phone lit up with incoming calls. "You've built your empire on lies, Richard," I said, gathering my things, "and today it comes down. Not with a groundbreaking ceremony, but with the truth." I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. "Oh, and I've arranged for the Boston Globe to receive an anonymous tip about today's events. They might have some questions about the Caldwell Tower ceremony this afternoon." As I walked out, I heard the chaos erupting behind me, demands for explanations, shouting, the sound of Richard's carefully constructed world imploding. In the elevator down to the lobby, I finally let the tears come, not for my lost job or for Richard's betrayal, but for my mother, who had taught me that integrity was worth any price. Outside, the summer air felt cleansing. I hailed a cab and gave the driver my address. It was time to plan a funeral and a new beginning. The aftermath unfolded like a hurricane. By nightfall, the story had broken across local news, and by the following morning, it had reached national financial outlets. "Meridian Technologies CEO under investigation for massive fraud," screamed the headlines. The Caldwell Tower groundbreaking was indefinitely postponed. The bronze statue quietly canceled. I spent that week arranging my mother's funeral, a small, dignified affair in the coastal town where she and my father had built their life together. Cousins, aunts, and old family friends gathered around me, none of them aware of what had transpired in Boston. To them, I was simply a grieving daughter, not the whistleblower who had brought down a corporate titan. 3 days after the funeral, as I was sorting through my mother's belongings in our family home, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Is this Sarah Adams?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "This is Andrea Weiss, chairperson of the Meridian Technologies Board of Directors. We need to talk." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. The board had conducted an emergency investigation that confirmed everything I'd revealed and uncovered even more. Richard had been arrested attempting to board a private plane to a non-extradition country. James Whitaker had turned state's evidence, providing prosecutors with years of documentation. The company was in crisis. "We need someone who understands what happened, who knows where all the bodies are buried, so to speak," Andrea explained. "The board would like to offer you a position as interim chief compliance officer while we rebuild." The irony wasn't lost on me, being offered a job by the same company that had humiliated and fired me. But I understood the opportunity it represented, not just for me, but for all the employees whose livelihoods hung in the balance. "I'll consider it," I told her, "but I have conditions." 2 weeks later, I walked back into Meridian's offices. The atmosphere was entirely different, subdued, anxious, but with an undercurrent of relief. Richard's larger-than-life portrait had been removed from the lobby. In its place hung a new company mission statement emphasizing transparency, ethics, and employee welfare. My first official act was to reinstate the comprehensive health insurance plan. My second was to establish a relief fund for employees who had suffered financial hardship due to Richard's schemes. The money came directly from the recovery of his ill-gotten assets. The yacht sold, the vacation homes liquidated, the art collection auctioned. Not everyone welcomed me back. Some had been loyal to Richard. Others were simply embarrassed by their complicity through silence. Sarah from accounting avoided eye contact in the hallways. Michael from legal requested a transfer to another department. I understood their discomfort. I represented a chapter they wanted to forget. But there were surprises too. James Whitaker, who had avoided prosecution through cooperation, stopped by my office one afternoon. "I should have done what you did years ago," he admitted, unable to meet my gaze. I knew what was happening, but I convinced myself I had no choice. "We always have choices," I replied. "Some are just harder than others." 6 months into my new role, while reviewing old company records, I discovered something unexpected, a connection between Richard and my family that I never knew existed. 25 years earlier, my father's printing business had nearly gone bankrupt. An anonymous investor had provided the capital to keep it afloat. That investor, it turned out, was Richard's father. The revelation sent me spiraling. Had Richard known who I was all along? Had his treatment of me been some twisted game related to this past connection? I drove to the federal detention center where Richard awaited trial. After passing through security and being led to a sterile visiting room, I found myself face to face with a diminished version of the man who had once terrified me. His designer suits replaced by prison khaki, his commanding presence reduced to nervous tics. "Sarah Adams," he said, a ghost of his old smirk appearing. "Come to gloat?" "I came for answers," I replied, sliding the old investment documents across the table. "Did you know about this?" He glanced at the papers, and I watched his expression change, not to anger or defiance, but something more complex. For the first time, I saw Richard Caldwell truly surprised. "My father never mentioned this," he said finally. "He made many investments I never knew about. So your treatment of me, the firing, all of it, that wasn't related to this old debt?" Richard laughed, a hollow sound. "Not everything is a conspiracy, Adams. I treated you badly because that's how I treated everyone. I fired you because you were a threat." As strange as it sounds, his answer brought me peace. Our connection had been random chance, not some elaborate revenge plot. Rising to leave, I had one final question. "Why did you do it, Richard? You were already successful, already wealthy. Why risk everything?" He looked away, toward the small window with its view of nothing. "Because I could," he answered simply. "Because no one stopped me. Until you." The rebuilding of Meridian took more than a year. We sold the land purchased for the Caldwell Tower and instead invested in upgrading our existing offices with sustainable technology. We restructured compensation to be more equitable. We created a corporate ethics division with real power to investigate concerns. Throughout this time, I continued living in my childhood home in Maine, commuting to Boston 3 days a week. The old house by the sea became my sanctuary, the place where I could process everything that had happened. One evening, as I walked along the shore at sunset, I received a call from Andrea Weiss. "The board has made a decision," she said. "We want you to stay on permanently as Chief Compliance Officer. You've earned it." The waves crashed against the rocks, a sound that had soothed generations of my family. "I'll accept," I said, "on one condition." "Name it." "The company contributes to a healthcare fund for families affected by cancer, named after my mother." The Elizabeth Adams Memorial Fund was established the following month. As for Richard's grand gesture, the Caldwell Tower never rose from the ground. Instead, the company donated the architectural plans to the city's historical society as a reminder of what happens when ambition eclipses integrity. The unexpected twist in all of this? 3 months ago, Richard's lawyer contacted me with stunning news. Richard had terminal cancer diagnosed shortly after his arrest, and in a move that no one could have predicted, he had changed his will, naming me as the executor of his estate. "He said you were the only person he could trust to do the right thing," the lawyer explained, seemingly as baffled as I was. So here I stood yesterday at Richard Caldwell's sparsely attended funeral, the executor of his estate. The final irony in our complicated history. His will contained one last surprise. He had directed the majority of his remaining legitimate assets to be added to my mother's healthcare fund. His last note to me read simply, "Some debts can never be repaid, but we try anyway." People often ask if I regret what I did, if the cost was too high. I think about my parents, about the values they instilled in me on the rocky coast of Maine. I think about my mother's final words to me, "Let it go or let it out," and I know I made the right choice. The truth is both a burden and a liberation. Speaking it cost me a job, but saved my integrity. It brought down a corrupt leader, but saved a company worth saving. Most importantly, it honored my mother's memory in a way that no silent compliance ever could. Life rarely gives us clean victories or perfect justice. Instead, it offers us choices, moments when we decide who we are and what we stand for. Those moments define us far more than any title or paycheck ever could. If you've enjoyed this story or found something valuable in it, please consider subscribing to the channel for more real-life stories of courage and consequence. Leave a comment below sharing a time when you had to make a difficult choice between security and truth. Your experiences matter, and they might just give someone else the courage they need to make their own difficult choice. Remember, in the end, we're all just trying to leave things a little better than we found them. Sometimes that means walking away. Sometimes it means standing your ground. And sometimes it means returning to rebuild what was broken. Thank you for listening to my story.